Hello. Welcome, everybody. This is Magda Terrer. I am the Shtetl Chair in Judaic Studies, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our next installment of conversations and presentations related to epidemics and Jewish history. During our first conversation with Joshua Teplitsky, someone asked a question about the Cholera Weddings, which we didn't address, and today we'll have the opportunity to learn more about it from Natan Meir. Natan Meir, our speaker today, is the Lorry I. Lokey Professor of Judaic Studies at the Harold Schnitzer Family Program of Judaic Studies at Portland State University. He is a scholar of the social and cultural history of East European Jewry and is also the author of Kiev, Jewish Metropolis, A History 1859-1914, which came out in 2010. The book explores the ins and outs of the Jewish community and places Jews within the urban and imperial framework. It is a major contribution not just to modern Jewish history, but also to the history of Kiev, Imperial Russia, and to urban studies. This book, it seems, has led to the forthcoming in August book, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, the Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of the Jewish Eastern Europe, 1800-1939, about which we'll hear a little bit today. Natan Meir is has also an interest and experience in public history. He has contributed to the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow, has led public tours focused on Jewish history in Eastern Europe. And on a personal note, I have known Natan Meir as a colleague and a friend since graduate school, where we overlapped at Columbia, and he also has spoken at Fordham. So today, I'm going to hand it over. We'll learn about another pandemic, that one that raged across the globe in a number of times in the 19th and early 20th century, cholera. So Natan, the floor is yours. And just one more note, please submit your questions in the Q&A section of the screen. Thank you very much, Natan Meir. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really nice to be back at Fordham, even though I'm not actually there, but I'm there virtually, and it's really a pleasure. I did speak about this project a few years ago when I was on sabbatical in New York. I had the honor of being a fellow at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, and as Magda was as well a few years ago. And that was while I was still working through some of these ideas. And when I gave that talk, Magda's very focused questions gave me the opportunity to think very carefully about certain aspects of this project. And as always, I'm very grateful to her for her carefully thought out questions, which I'm sure will also follow the short talk that I'm going to give now. I'm going to share my screen with you now. And this is, of course, as Magda mentioned, part of the larger project that this book encompasses, Stepchildren of the Shtetl. Actually, it's a very minor correction. It's not coming out in August. The official release date is Bastille Day, July 14th. But I'm told by some people, including my mother, that the book is actually shipping now. So apparently it's out. I don't have it yet, but some people have it in their hands. So at some point, I hope that I will have it as well. So as you can see here from this little blurb here on the bottom, the book examines the lives and roles of the outcasts of Jewish society in Eastern Europe. And those outcasts I define in the book as beggars, mentally ill people, or as they were known, madmen, madwomen, people with disabilities, and poor orphans, and argues that despite their marginal status, and in fact, in some ways, because of their marginal status, they played an important symbolic role in the process of modernization, which scholars like myself who study the 19th and 20th century in Eastern Europe are particularly concerned with. How did Jews become modern? How did they enter the modern world? In that period, the 19th and the early 20th centuries. The book, as you can see, goes up to the eve of World War II. So what I want to talk with you about today is one chapter of the book, which is dedicated to the Cholera Wedding. I'm just going to focus on some certain kind of the most important elements of the Cholera Wedding and how I explain it in the book. Because I dedicate a whole chapter to it, there's a lot of detail that that I can't include today, but maybe that will come out in the Q&A. And if it doesn't, then you'll know where to look for it, because the book is apparently out or will be out very, very soon. So I want to talk by starting briefly. I want to start by talking briefly about cholera itself. Cholera was, in many ways, a modern pandemic. So it had existed for centuries in the Indian subcontinent, but it was modern innovations like innovations in transportation in particular that made it possible for cholera to leave the subcontinent and spread to other parts of the world as a pandemic, which it did many times in the 19th century, and then an additional pandemic in the early 20th century before it was finally quelled. And as we know, it hit working class neighborhoods wherever we look, whether we're looking at Europe or North America. It hit working class neighborhoods very hard. We now understand, because of poor sanitation, because of primitive water supply systems. But for much of the 19th century, before the bacterium had been discovered, people did not understand why that was. And so very often there was a kind of moral judgment made about those working class neighborhoods and the cholera. And it was assumed that because people were poor, because they did not have as many opportunities to bathe as did people in more prosperous neighborhoods, that those were the reasons that they were afflicted more severely with the cholera. There were also often connections made with prostitution, because prostitutes also tended to be hit very hard by cholera, and so there were links that people drew between cholera and sexual immorality writ large. Now, in the United States, historians have shown that because of the circumstances that we've described, because cholera tended to hit poor areas much harder, that it was associated with marginalized groups, African Americans, for example, also Irish immigrants. And there's also some evidence that in the Russian Empire, it was sometimes, not always, but sometimes associated with Jews, who were, of course, a marginalized group in that country. Now, there were many popular remedies for cholera, certainly before scientists understood how it was that cholera came about, because there were all kinds of theories about how cholera spread. The theory about miasma in the air, certain ill humors, or perhaps certain kinds of food and drink that people ingested that they should not, and that was suspected of bringing cholera. You can see here on the lower left, I have an image from 1832, the 1832 cholera epidemic in New York. Be temperate in eating and drinking, avoid raw vegetables and unripe fruit. So that's an example of the kinds of theories that abounded at the time. And of course, magical remedies were also very popular. One of those in particular that we see in Eastern Europe was the magic circle. Actually, the magic circle is, we could find in almost any culture because it's kind of such a foundational aspect of magic. But in particular in Eastern Europe, the magic circle was used to ward off epidemic. The idea was that you could draw some sort of symbolic circle around your town or your city, and that would prevent the cholera from entering. You can see from this image on the lower right that it has, it persists to this day. Just a couple months ago, the Russian Orthodox Patriarch circled Moscow in a large motorcade with an icon, as you can see, and that was meant to try to ward off the coronavirus. The Jews of Eastern Europe apparently also used the magic circle, and this is not the only example we could provide of shared magical remedies between Jews and Christians. And there were plenty of other remedies as well, some of them belonging to the realm of kind of normative religion, and some of them bordering on or fully residing in the realm of magic. One of them that might be somewhere in the middle, for example, would be checking all of the mezuzot, the kind of quasi-amulets on the door. They were often understood as amulets with pieces of parchment on the doors of Jewish homes that were understood to protect Jewish homes from danger, and in popular understanding, to protect them from demons. And so people often checked to make sure that the mezuzot on their doors were written correctly, that they were not damaged in any way, because that was something, it was understood, that could bring on evil. Another remedy that was proposed, this one in the more normative realm, is that people should give increased levels of charity. And this is something that we'll come back to today, the idea that perhaps the community had somehow wronged the poor or done wrong by them over the previous years, and that this was the reason for the epidemic, and therefore one should give more charity than usual to, in a sense, make up for that. Now, sorry, that little quote there should not be at the top right now, so I'm going to just take that out so you can see more clearly. Sorry about that. Okay, so what is the cholera wedding? This was one of the remedies that the Jews of Eastern Europe came up with. And apparently, in the very first cholera epidemic to hit the Russian Empire in the early 1830s. Now, there's some evidence that there may have been a precedent for the cholera wedding, but as far as I could tell, and I've done quite a bit of research on this, this is the first hard evidence we have for the cholera wedding existing. And it emerges as the marriage of two orphans, or perhaps two poor people, in the cemetery. And that's very unusual in Judaism, to have a wedding in the cemetery. One ordinarily would not hold a wedding there. And the sources from the 1830s are very, very terse. All we know is that there's two poor people or two orphans who are married in the cemetery, and that's meant to stop the epidemic. Now, starting in the 1860s, the custom seems to spread much, much more widely. So we only have one or two mentions in that earlier period. And in the second half of the 19th century, the cholera wedding now includes all of those people who I just mentioned to you earlier, who are the marginalized of Jewish society. I often use the term outcasts. So they can be beggars. They can be people with some kind of physical deformity. Sometimes they are what was known as the town fool, who was the kind of a ubiquitous figure in towns, in shtetls across Eastern Europe. And this was, we don't really know exactly who the town fool was. It seems to have been someone perhaps with a developmental disability of some kind. Sometimes it was someone who was mentally ill. The descriptions make it difficult to understand exactly, and it often varied. And often the narratives that we have of the Cholera Wedding are, I would say, somewhat troubling. One of the explanations for the Cholera Wedding, and we'll get to that in a second in more detail, was that it was a kind of reparation, if you will. To go back for a second to the idea of giving increased charity during a time of cholera, the kind of standard or normative explanation for the Cholera Wedding is that it was a great good deed that one could do, a mitzvah, for the people who had been previously marginalized by the community. And by marrying them in the midst of the community and giving them community support for the marriage and then supporting them thereafter, the community would be righting the wrong that it had done by not treating them as well as it should have previously. So that's the idea anyway. That's a kind of apologetic explanation, right? In reality, the way that the wedding is often described does not seem to fit that compassionate description of the wedding. It was often a raucous affair, apparently. There was a great deal of drinking and carousing. And it seems as though, at least in some cases, it was almost something of a freak show, that people were able to kind of use it as entertainment, and we'll talk about that in a second as well, to take their minds off of the horror of cholera and focus on this, what was essentially a kind of entertaining show in front of them of these two, one would use the term in modern Israeli Hebrew, miskenim, of these two poor people, and not poor in the monetary sense, of course, but poor outcasts who are being married to each other. Now, the wedding, we have waves of the wedding that take place with the cholera pandemics in the 1860s, in the 1890s. Then we have another wave, which is not so much cholera, but the terrible epidemics that accompany World War I and the upheaval and chaos in Eastern Europe in the wake of World War I. And it also, during that same time, appears in the land of Israel. We have reports from there, and also in the United States and Canada. There seems to be a kind of a lull in the 1920s and the 1930s, and then the Cholera Wedding comes back, at least in a few instances, during the Holocaust, when disease sweeps the ghettos. So how can we explain the Cholera Wedding? It is a very peculiar and unsettling ritual, I think, at least for many people. I also argue in the book that although it is troubling, it is also, from the point of view of an anthropologist of religion, incredibly creative ritual. And I try to show that by explaining how many different elements of Jewish ritual and in some ways the human psyche it draws upon. And I'm not going to go into all of them right now, but I do want to explain a few of them. So the first one is what I already mentioned, the idea that it's a great mitzvah, it's a great charitable deed that one can do for these outcasts. And I don't want to denigrate that possibility, because it is very, very possible that there were people within these communities who genuinely felt that it was time to make it up to these people who had been treated often poorly by the community in previous years. Another interesting route, another interesting influence that we can examine, that we can follow, is the idea that an orphan's prayer, and this is within Jewish tradition, within Jewish custom, the idea that an orphan's prayer is particularly effective, and we can see this going back to the communities of medieval Germany. And this is probably related to this idea of one of the bridal couple, either the bride or the groom, or perhaps both, often being orphans. And therefore, one could try to reach God through the outcast, through the orphan. And we understand there that they are kind of liminal figures on the border between life and death, because orphans had experienced death much more viscerally and more early on than most other people. And the Cholera Wedding itself, of course, taking place in the cemetery, is a liminal moment between life and death. Right? It's an attempt to enter into the realm of death, which is the cemetery. And of course, the realm of death has now entered into life itself, because the pandemic is, if you understand it anthropologically, is death itself kind of inserting itself into the realm of life. There's also a long tradition, going back to ancient times, of Jews praying in a cemetery during a crisis. Rabbis often did not approve of this custom because they felt that it was too much like praying for intercession from the ancestors, but we know that it continued to happen through the generations. Now, I'm going to offer now two more possibilities in some greater detail. One possible explanation is something that I alluded to a few minutes ago, the idea that the Cholera Wedding was a kind of entertainment. Now, why would you need entertainment in the middle of a pandemic? Now, I think some of us maybe be able to relate to this idea a little bit more closely or personally than we might have before the pandemic that we're currently experiencing. We know that it is a terrifying experience to live in the middle of a pandemic. We know that from our own experience now with COVID-19, which we barely understand as a disease. And of course, they barely understood cholera, a disease, either. They only know that they knew that it was a terrifying disease. Someone could be struck down literally within hours of contracting the bacteria. And the way that it killed was also particularly scary to people. Not only how quickly it killed people, but also the way that that one's bodily fluids just seem to kind of ooze, and not only ooze, but also kind of evaporate from one's body within a matter of hours. Now, one of the reigning theories of the time in the 19th century was that if you were afraid of the disease, you could be more susceptible to it. And in some ways, we know that from our own experience in a more updated way, because we've been told, and I think many of us understand, that mental health, good mental and emotional health, is important, especially important during this time, right? Because we don't want to succumb to depression or to fear, because that will bring us down and probably depress our immune system as well. So perhaps there's some logic to this. And we know that in places across the continent, from France to Britain, there is evidence that there were people who tried to spit in the face of cholera, as it were, tried to create this festive atmosphere, even as people were dying all around. This may be an explanation for the Cholera Wedding. And in fact, we know that in a classic rabbinic apologetic explanation for the Cholera Wedding, which I've put here on the screen from a work of a rabbi who attempted to explain many, many different Jewish customs in this book, Sefer HaMat'amim. He also explains the Cholera Wedding, and he says that it's a celebration of mass joy and music and much happiness to arouse happiness in the masses so that they not be sad, which is a great danger in this matter, so that they not be afraid and become accustomed to the cemetery and not fear death. And in a later revision of the book that came out a few years later, he also wrote that Jews have cholera weddings in part because he says, we are not permitted to attend theaters and circuses. And so therefore, our entertainment is the cholera wedding. And for me, there's no clear evidence of the idea that this was not just a kind of compassionate charitable ritual, but it was really meant in many ways mostly for the attendees, for the people of the town who could flock to this wedding and experience some measure of I'll call it fun, actually, right? I'll call it fun, even though that may not be the term that they would have used at the time. Now, the last explanation, and for me, the one that's in fact the most important because it fits into my larger argument that I make in the book about the role that that marginalized people played in Jewish society in Eastern Europe, is the Cholera Wedding as a kind of sacrificial offering, where the bride and the groom are offered as a kind of scapegoat upon which the community hopes that the epidemic will land in a kind of transfer from the community as a whole to these people in the middle who are being married now. And I'll just say a few words to explain what I mean by that, and then maybe we can try to flesh it out a little bit in the Q&A if people want to hear more about this particular aspect. So one of my primary arguments in the book is that the outcasts or the marginalized people of Jewish society in Eastern Europe can serve as an other, right? And the Jews themselves in the Russian Empire were already an other. That's very clear from the way that they were treated, often persecuted, experienced all kinds of restrictions and popular anti-Semitism, governmental anti-Semitism, but the Jews themselves also have their own other. And this is not uncommon, sociologically speaking, for minority groups to have an internal other that they can then blame in some form or another for the problems that they face as a group. And so that means that, for example, accusations that are flung at the Jews as a whole, one that comes to mind is the idea that Jews were parasites on the body of society, that they did not actually do any work themselves, but they sponged off of people who did real work. And that is an accusation that Jewish reformers, progressives, often wealthy Jews, then they leveled at beggars, for example, Jewish beggars, right? Jewish beggars don't do any work, they sponge off of the community, and so on and so forth. So anti-Semitic accusations are often deflected onto the outcasts of the Jewish community. And if we look through Jewish history, we'll see that there is a tradition of marginalized people serving as scapegoats. So I list a few examples here. There is a ritual that on the eve of Yom Kippur, of the Day of Atonement, that a chicken is kind of waved over the head, and symbolically one's sins are transferred to the chicken. That ritual is called kapores. And we know that Jewish beggars, at least in the early modern period, there was a tradition for Jewish beggars to eat the kapores chicken, in some ways because it was loaded with sin. So they were the ones who were seen fit to consume it. There is a Purim spiel, a folk play that was presented on the holiday of Purim, the carnival holiday of Purim, called the Beggars Farce, which I explore in detail in the book. And it's about the wedding of two beggars. And the ritual, the wedding itself in the Purim spiel ends with the master of ceremonies saying to the couple, "May you both be punished." And here you'll see in the Yiddish/Hebrew term kapore appears again. A kapore zot ir verin, instead of me and the whole Jewish people. So there seems to be some sort of cultural/sociological tradition that the outcasts, certainly the beggars in Jewish society, are going to somehow or other bear the punishment that would ordinarily be meted out to the people as a whole. During the conscription of Jewish men under Nicholas I, which began in 1827 and went into all the way to the 1850s, which was a particularly harsh regime of conscription, when very often the Jewish communities who were forced to hand over, to choose the recruits from the Jewish community to the Russian military, when they very clearly often chose recruits from among the least powerful, the most vulnerable, the poorest of the Jewish community. There's a folk song that apparently dates to that time, which refers to the only child, and only children were not supposed to be chosen, but in fact, in some cases they were, if this family was particularly powerless, or if it owed back taxes to the Jewish community, who would be drafted into the army as a scapegoat. And this is the text of that folk song. Tears flow in the streets. One could wash oneself in children's blood. Woe, what a misfortune is this? Will dawn never come again? They drag little chicks from cheder, from school, dress them in military uniforms. Our elders, our rabbis, help to force them into military service. And that's a reference to the fact that the Jewish community leadership was in fact forced to choose the recruits. Zusharakover has 7 sons, but not one was drafted, apparently because he had sway in the community and was able to pull strings. But Leah, the widow's only son, is made to pay the price for the Kahal's sins. And the Yiddish is a kapora falkoroshe zind. And another way to translate that, I would submit, is a scapegoat for the Kahal's treachery. So again, a kapore, the poorest, the most vulnerable, the marginalized of the Jewish community, is made to pay the price for everyone. So my argument, as far as the Cholera Wedding goes, is that the bride and groom are functioning as substitute victims for the epidemic. And in fact, there's a modernist Yiddish short story that was written in the 1920s that makes that point very clearly. Story by Joseph Opatoshu has a woman presenting gifts to the Cholera Wedding couple, and her chant to them is, "From me to you, may it pass from me to you." In other words, may the plague, may the epidemic not fall on us as a body, the Jewish people, but in fact pass over to you. Now, just very briefly to conclude, there's another part of my argument in the book, really the last chapter of the book, which I'm not going to talk about at length at all, but I just want to mention to you that the trajectory of the marginal figure goes in maybe a surprising direction, starting around the turn of the century, starting around 1900, when the marginal figure, at least in cultural terms, at least in literature and film, often becomes a protagonist, a hero, a sympathetic hero that people are supposed to identify with, and in fact, in some ways represents the entire Jewish people, but this time not in a negative way, but in a positive way. Although in some instances, the idea is that the marginal figure still needs to be transformed in order to be redeemed. But a great example of this is the wonderful Yiddish movie The Light Ahead, which was based on a novel by Mendel Mocher Sforim, the great Yiddish writer. And in The Light Ahead, you can see that Fischke and Hodel, Fischke is Fischke der Krummer, he is a cripple, and Hodel is blind. So they are the kind of, they fall into the traditional category of the outcast, but you can see from this picture how beautiful they are. They're the couple that you want to root for, and in fact, you do root for them. And there's a cholera wedding in the movie towards the end. And what's interesting here is that really the joke is on the townspeople who organized the cholera wedding, because Fischke and Hodel have the last laugh because they know that they're actually in love with each other. So although the townspeople think that they're carrying out a traditional cholera wedding, aha, we're marrying these two outcasts to each other, what a laugh. In fact, Fischke and Hodel benefit because they love each other, and then they flee to greener pastures. Now, did this really represent the reality of marginalized people? Probably not, but it is a very interesting cultural trope that I try to investigate in the book. Now, I had thought that the Cholera Wedding, we had seen the last of it in World War II, but in fact, in March, my colleague Shaul Stampfer in Israel alerted me to the fact that there was indeed a wedding of 2 orphans being carried out in the ultra-Orthodox city of Bnei Brak, outside of Tel Aviv. And we have much more, therefore, to discuss, apparently. This kind of magical ritual is tremendously powerful, and therefore I, of all people who know it quite well, should not at all have been surprised that it has staying power even many decades after we thought we had seen the last of it. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to interacting with you via the questions.
Thank you, Natan. That was really very interesting. So I will just ask a couple of questions about what you presented, and maybe you can then tell us a little bit more about your book, and especially what's studying the stepchildren of the Shtetl, as you call them in the title, reveals about society and culture. But before we go to it, I wonder what the sources you draw from were literary sources. What could you comment on the use of these literary sources, and also what other type of sources about these rituals or communal responses to pandemics such as cholera may be drawn from?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because the issue of sources is a really vital one in this work in particular. For anyone who's doing work on marginalized people in society, it's always going to be more difficult to find historical sources, because these people generally don't tend to generate the sources themselves. They're often illiterate. People don't tend to write about them. So in fact, when I was focusing on a particular aspect of my research on the Hekdesh, on the Jewish poorhouse, which was ubiquitous throughout Eastern Europe, there was a poorhouse in every single shtetl. It was really difficult to find information on it. And I had to, and this was true for many aspects of the material that I was looking at, I had to choose fragments, right? Find a fragment here, a fragment there, and try to cobble together a picture. And now I'm talking about kind of more traditional historical sources. So archival sources, memoirs, for example, the press. Those are the kinds of sources that I would ordinarily turn to, and those are the ones that I used to a great extent in the Kiev book. But here, and this is part of my development as a historian, and this is also thanks in many ways to my year at the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library, that I embraced literature as a source, which I had never done before, because as I read the literary descriptions of the beggars, for example, I felt that although obviously they're not mimetic, they're not a kind of it's not the author is not holding a mirror image up to society. You can't read it like that. But they embody some central elements of how that particular society felt about these people. So one of the things that I try to do in the book is to use these literary sources to give us a sense of not how a specific ritual unfolded or how something specific happened in a city or a town, but how did this society envision these people? How did it use them? And very often these authors were sharp critics of Jewish society. So they had very, very important things to say, especially about the treatment of the poor and the marginalized in literature. And that to me was it shouldn't have been a revelation, I suppose, but it was a revelation, and I was really glad that I embarked on that particular path.
literature often reveals social cultural values much more than institutional sources. There is a wonderful article from a few years ago in the New Yorker by Jill Lepore on the contrast between history and literature. And she uses the metaphor that history and literature are like two siblings throwing food at each other. So I highly recommend it. It's a really wonderful article. So let's move to some of the questions that were asked by the, I have more, but I think your discussion about the sources and what studying and the difficulty finding sources about marginalized people and then turning to literature, I think addressed some of the larger cultural questions about what it means and what it means to study people who are marginalized. So we have a question about the differences between Russia and Galicia. So one of the reader is bringing up the 1831 cholera epidemic in Galicia that was marked by a paradox. Jews were blamed for the spread of the disease from Brode to Lemberg, but it was also a Jewish physician, Jacob Rappaport, who was placed at the helm of public health policies in Lemberg. So the question is Rappaport's description of the disease and his observation of frequent hand washing and changes of clothes as protection against disease was printed in Berlin and elsewhere. So the question is whether in your work you are aware of the Cholera Wedding custom in Galicia, or is it more of a Russian phenomenon?
So this is a great question, and there's actually two different facets to it as well. So I'll answer one first, and then I'll get to the second one. So yes, most of the list of cholera weddings that I compiled, most of them were in the Russian Empire, so either in the Pale Settlement or in the Kingdom of Poland. But there were a few in Galicia, and in fact, some of the earliest ones were there. So there's still more work to be done here. I'm sure there's more information in the archives and I'm not an expert in Habsburg archives, so that's not something that I could do. But it definitely was a cross-border phenomenon. Now, the other thing that the questioner mentions, which is very important, is that there's this paradox, and this happens in the Russian Empire too. What he's saying about Brody, I was nodding my head when you were reading the question, because it happens in Kiev as well. One of the Jewish responses, especially for Jewish progressives and for merchants who are often the leaders of the community, their response to the fact that the masses of poor Jews are usually or often associated with cholera because of the dense way they live, and they're often they're perceived as being as being filthy, is to create structures, including hospitals and clinics, for example, and Rappaport is another good example, to create structures and institutions that will show that Jews are actually not only healthy, but that they are attempting to improve the health of the entire society. So the Jewish hospital in Kiev, for example, that was from the very outset, it was created for both Jews and Christians, and it played a very important role during the cholera epidemics in the Russian Empire, in Kiev, obviously in Kiev in particular, partly because they wanted to show that Jews not only cared for themselves health-wise, but also for everyone else. So there is a kind of overcompensation, I think, on the part of Jewish leadership to show that that Jews, in fact, are not at all to blame for cholera, but in fact, they're going to be the ones who are going to help solve the problem.
And I think that's true that you have this, despite some of the maybe literary sources appearing kind of close and insular and inward bound, Jews and Jewish society were always aware of the Christian gaze and what was happening. So there's a question that maybe sort of related to this discussion we are having right now. Were there any Christian viewers or interpreters of cholera weddings who might have seen these marginalized figures who carry the sins of the community as a kind of Christ figure, maybe influenced by the tradition of the Holy Fool in Russia?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, really great, because I also talk about the Holy Fool in the book as well, especially when I discuss the role of the of mentally ill people in Jewish society. And the Holy Fool, for those who are not familiar, is a tradition within Eastern Christianity that connects some kind of insanity, some kind of mental illness, with passion for Christ. And the idea is that you are so passionate that you lose your mind. And generally, that tradition that had no parallel in Judaism because of the emphasis that Judaism, at least normative rabbinic Judaism, placed on study, and therefore you had to have your wits about you, because if you didn't, then you couldn't study Torah, right? And going crazy was not going to help you at all. But there are echoes of a Holy Fool tradition here and there in Jewish history, so now to go back to the original question itself. We know that there were Christian observers to the Cholera Wedding, and we know that because it often took place in small to medium-sized shtetls, that there were Christians who would come to watch. It was kind of a phenomenon, and who knows? Maybe the Christians also hoped that it would do something, because we know that Christians often believed in elements of Jewish magic, and sometimes the reverse was true as well. But I don't have any evidence that anyone saw the cholera bride and groom as kind of suffering on behalf of the people. I know I said something like that in my talk, but it doesn't have the positive valence that the Christ-like figure would have, right? It just doesn't have that kind of we see you suffering and we identify with your suffering and we love you for suffering. To me, that's not what's going on. It's a denigrating, shameful kind of experience. And the community in that sense is really distancing itself from those people rather than trying to come closer to them.
It's interesting because in my work on blood libel and the Jewish responses, the word capoeira is used in especially the Yiddish songs and tales, and it is literally meant to and then described to as this sacrifice for the sins of the community, and it actually acts as a kind of counter narrative to the Christian notions of the martyrs, Christian children as martyrs in place of Christ. So it's a very interesting set of counter narrative that's produced in the thing. When you were speaking earlier, I was about the spread of this this ritual. I was thinking that must have been perceived as effective if it spread, right? So there must have been some perception that the ritual does ward off cholera. And so I wonder whether you could comment on that. And there is also someone comments relating to your discussion of the orphans hearing prayers, orphans' prayers being heard better, that there is an idea of God answering prayers of the bride and groom as they are under the chuppah. So can you maybe comment on that?
Yeah, every time I talk about the Cholera Wedding, I learn something new from my audience, and I'm so grateful for that. And in fact, that seems like actually pretty obvious that it's understood that the prayers of the bride and groom are more efficacious on the wedding day. And it's funny because I actually never heard that argument advanced in any of the sources. And it seems like it's pretty apparent, if this is a way of trying to appeal to God and to God's mercy to stop the epidemic, then you would think they would refer to this idea that the bride and the groom's prayers, but I never heard about it before. It is very, very suggestive though. Sorry, Magda, I'm blanking on the first part of the question that you just asked.
I am blanking on it too.
Maybe somebody will help us out.
Yes.
I know what it was. Was it efficacious? I mean,
yeah.
I personally think that it spread, not so much because it helped in the epidemic, because of course the epidemic is always going to end, right? So whenever you do this, and it's usually spoken about as a last resort, so presumably it's going to be carried out once cholera has ravaged the town. And at that point, it's probably going to peter out anyway, right? As we, unfortunately, as we now know, better than we could have before. And so therefore, it may have been seen as effective in that way. But also, I think it spread because it has so much inner power as a ritual. It's just so evocative in so many ways. And one of my contentions in the book is that although it seems, I think, to people at the time like an ancient ritual that goes back many centuries, in fact, it's a modern innovation. It only comes about in the 1830s, and in some ways, it's actually a response to modernity. I think it's traditionalists in the community often saying, and this was true, by the way, throughout Europe. We didn't get to this part of it, but there were many instances during cholera epidemics in Europe, including in the Russian Empire, when ordinary people basically revolted against authority because they felt that the medical and the police establishment was trying to kill them. They didn't understand the epidemic, and all they knew was when people went to a cholera hospital, they died. And so this is the Jewish community's revolt, in essence, against the rabbinic establishment, which, and of course also the communal establishment, which says you should do this, you should do that, quarantine, the other thing. And they say, forget it. None of that works. We don't trust any of it. We just give us our old-time religion, which is the cholera wedding.
When cholera is also a modern phenomenon for the Western world as well, as you noticed, right? That was one of the reasons why this didn't come up in the earlier sources and earlier discussions. But that what you were just saying ties to a couple of questions that were asked. One is, how is it all related to modernity for the Jews? And you touched upon it, but I think more broadly you can maybe tie it to your book. And the other one is about the response of rabbis. That is, you were talking about the a folk kind of ritual that was created, but how were the rabbis responding to this new ritual? Even the place at the cemetery. So there are different innovations that are not quite jiving with the traditional practices within Judaism.
Right. Magda, can I choose a question to answer?
Yeah, of course.
There's some great questions coming up here, and one of them is let's see, where I was just looking at it. Well, basically, the question was, I can't see it right now. I don't know where it went, but it was, how does all of this relate to modernity for the Jews?
That's what I thought.
Yeah, which is a great question. Basically, what I should say is read my book, but I'll tell you briefly now the way I think it does. What I argue in the book is that the very process of modernization itself required, okay, and maybe I shouldn't use the term required, but I'll use it anyway, required that Eastern European Jews as a group single out a kind of looking glass mirror image of themselves, that they could then say, these are the people who represent everything negative about Jews. These are the ones who represent everything that's backward and medieval and filthy and so on and so forth. And we are not them. And ultimately what happens when Jewish politics emerges around the turn of the century, very often movements like Zionism and Jewish socialism, the Bund, take that outcast, the image of the outcast, and they say, aha, this is actually what Eastern European Jewry is. They were specifically referred to East European Jews. We're all beggars, we're all orphans, we're all outcasts, and now we're going to transform ourselves into something else. So in fact, the outcast becomes a very evocative symbol. Now, their actual lives don't usually enter into the equation, unfortunately, right? Because people are generally more concerned with them on a kind of political, cultural trope with them as symbols than as real people. But I try to connect the two in the book. So that's the connection to modernity. Someone asked how the Cholera Wedding couples fare afterwards. Mm-hmm. From the evidence we have, generally not any better than they fared beforehand. So if we know that in some narratives they're beggars before and they continue to beg afterwards as a couple, and their children beg as well. So although the community is supposed to kind of support them, basically what it does is it gives them the same place in the community that it did before, which could be said to, in fact, perpetuate the cycle of marginalization.
And the question that I sort of put together from some of the questions about the rabbis and their response to these rituals that were clearly innovative in ways that go against some of the typical practices or practices, established practices in Judaism. So like the cemetery, like the ceremony, clearly it is now part of the, given the Bnei Brak wedding, that this is not something that is unusual.
Yes, there's a very interesting dynamic that happens in the late 19th century, by which apparently in the 1860s, when we had the first major wave of weddings, most of the rabbinic and communal authorities are against it, and they sometimes, we have reports of them pleading with the organizers of the wedding, don't do this, don't bring shame upon the community in this way. Then in the 1890s, by then it seems to have become normative within the community, and then you have a rabbi like Lipitz, the one who I quoted in my talk, who's saying, oh, this is fine, it's totally fine, it's a charitable deed that really is, is for the benefit of everyone. And it seems to, at that point, we have major rabbinic figure, well, maybe not major, but the rabbinic figures in each individual community, they're the ones who are carrying out the wedding. They may not like it very much, but they do it anyway.
Mm-hmm. And the question is about the Cholera Wedding in Bnei Brak, whether it happened when the pandemic started, but also I think you could maybe comment whether these rituals of the Cholera Wedding in Eastern Europe were when the pandemic started, or at what point do you think they were taking place in when the pandemic would arrive into Eastern European Shtetl?
Yeah, I don't know. To be honest with you, I really don't know enough about the Bnei Brak wedding to really say anything about it. All I know is that it was taking place at around that same moment when certain sectors within the Haredi community in Israel were being criticized for continuing to gather, like, for example, for funerals or for weddings. But I don't think this one was broken up in any way, and I'm not a sociologist of modern Israeli Haredi culture, so this is not, this is not really the direction for my research, but I'm hoping that somebody will take it up. Someone asked, who wished the cholera to another person? My argument, I don't have any evidence that anyone ever specifically said, I hope you get cholera and not me. My argument is more nuanced because I'm relying on these cultural and literary and religious tropes where I'm kind of, in a way, I'm speculating that the intention was for the evil, not necessarily the cholera itself, but for the evil that had befallen the community to pass from the community to these other people who, you see, they were already in the eyes of the community. These people were already liminal figures. They lived on the border between life and death already. And I can't go into detail about it now, but I explain how that works in my book from an anthropological perspective. And so therefore, it wouldn't have been such a weird thing for people to assume or wish that these people should somehow, take upon themselves the realm of death, because they already knew it better than most other people, if that makes sense. Okay.
Well, anything else you want to close with before we close out? We have about 1 minute.
Let's see. I'm looking quickly through the questions. Someone asked about the Cholera Wedding as an instance of the carnivalesque, again, for that interpretation, I also draw, in addition to drawing from the reports, the historical reports of the wedding, I also look at the literary understanding of it. And there too, we see that it is portrayed as, I'll go back to that term I used before, as a kind of a freak show where people are looking and laughing at the couple in the middle because of their otherness, because of their deformity, and also using the opportunity to rejoice. And imagine having a festival like this in a cemetery on, like, the graves are newly dug. people have just been buried, presumably in the days before. So again, it's a kind of thumbing your nose in the face of everything that would be considered usual and normative during this time, which is part of what the Carnivalesque is all about.
Let me just ask one more question and we'll close. And that question relates to whether this kind of work is only done in Jewish studies. So the topic of our discussion was a view from Jewish past about the epidemics. And I wonder whether you could draw some larger conclusions or closing thoughts that allow us to see how the Jewish past might inform larger questions about these topics, or whether, as the questioner is asking, whether there are studies from outside of the Jewish studies that deal with similar issues.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for asking that. And that was, in fact, I think our friend Lauren Goldenberg from the Coleman Center. Hi, Lauren. Good to see you here. Yeah, this is actually very important. And it's something that I addressed in a piece that I wrote for the LA Review of Books a few months ago at the outbreak when the pandemic was relatively new, and it actually became more salient as time went on, which is the idea of sacrificing the most vulnerable of a society during a time of epidemic is exactly what this is how I interpret what we've been seeing in society in American society over the past month and a half. The emphasis that Trump has placed on, we've got to open up, we've got to get things moving again. And yes, bad things are going to happen. That's a euphemism for people will die. And we know the people who are going to die. We know who those people are going to be. They're more likely to be people of color. They're more likely to be poor people. And these are the kind of marginalized people, that's kind of the parallel of the people that I'm talking about in my book. So I do think that there's a wider lesson to be drawn about how we treat the most vulnerable among us during a time of crisis.
And that's also the story of your book, the look at the marginalized people and what it tells us about the larger society as well. So thank you, Natan, for this talk and taking questions, and stay healthy. I wish everybody to stay healthy and join us next week for another conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.